What can you do about weight gain while you're sheltering in place, otherwise dealing with this pandemic? For the answer, stay tuned. A lot of people are reporting weight gain as they've been sheltering in place, working under stressful conditions, or otherwise dealing with this pandemic. Now, first of all, why is this happening? And I think that is probably pretty obvious. Two main causes. One is stress, and we know that stress, due to fear and financial worries, change in lifestyle and circumstances, all of this can raise the body's level of cortisol. And cortisol is a dangerous hormone to have elevated in a prolonged way. Elevated cortisol increases appetite. It makes you eat more. It also causes metabolic changes in the body that make you put on weight more when you overeat, and that weight tends to preferentially go in the abdomen between the organs. In other words, in the most dangerous place from a physiological standpoint. There's another cause which is related to all the insulin that's released from the high carbs, the simple sugars, the desserts, the pastries, the processed food, the snack foods that so dominate the eating behavior these days. And of course, also there's this phenomenon of grazing, where people are kind of munching on something all day long. There's been so much misinformation about weight loss promoted over the last 50 years. And basically, the kind of idea that you are going to lose weight by eating less and moving more has really been disproven in study after study. This kind of approach to weight loss, which dominates in modern medicine to this day, is simply ineffective. It doesn't work because when you reduce calories, the body lowers its metabolic rate. Initially, you may get a little weight loss that'll then taper off, and then the weight will inevitably come back, and then some more, which is obviously the last thing we want to happen. Now, this is particularly important during this COVID-19 pandemic, because one of the things we've learned is that people at highest risk seem to be those who have aspects of metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a constellation of factors, most clearly linked to resistance to the effects of insulin. When the body makes more insulin in response to the body's becoming more resistant to insulin, that inevitably leads to weight gain, because insulin is a very powerful stimulus to put on weight. Now, what about our dietary habits, particularly during this pandemic, may be contributing to high insulin levels? One, all the carbohydrates, the starches, the bakery goods, the goods with added simple sugars, things like white foods like white potatoes, white bread, white rice, etc., all lead to bumps in blood glucose, which lead to increased insulin secretion. And in people who are already metabolically challenged, which is most people who are overweight and a lot of us who are normal weight, also have these metabolic signs in the direction of metabolic syndrome. And this is so important during this COVID-19 epidemic because it appears that metabolic syndrome and the factors that go along with it increase the death rate something like 10 times from people without metabolic syndrome. So this is a huge difference. And now the good news is that if you change your diet and change specifically when you eat, you can have a huge difference that will start to come within days, and within weeks you can really start to turn things around. Even if you're severely overweight, you can still create changes that move you metabolically in a better direction. And it's the metabolic abnormalities, this propensity toward insulin resistance, etc., that seems to be the real risk factor, not necessarily the weight per se. Now, some of what I'm talking about, I want to say, is speculative based on what we're seeing, but it really does appear to fit the facts. And in a situation like this where we don't have full knowledge of what's going on, we've got to make decisions now that seem logical, that aren't dangerous, and which may end up making a big difference. So one thing is to follow the ancient Ayurvedic advice and fast for a significant period overnight, which means eat dinner at a reasonable hour and then don't have anything else, anything caloric at all before you have breakfast. And if you can make that be 12 or even better, 14, 15, 16 hours or more even. So then what happens, even if you have relatively high levels of insulin during parts of the day, by fasting overnight, you're creating periods of lower insulin overnight. This can make a huge difference, both in terms of weight and in terms of inflammation and the other things that go along with metabolic syndrome. The other easy target, or maybe easier said than done, but the other easy target is to refrain from snacks. To have breakfast and then don't have anything again caloric until lunch, and have your big lunch, and then don't have anything again till dinner. Eat 3 meals a day, no snacking, as some of our grandmothers would have told us way back when. This turns out to be great advice because it allows there to be these peaks and valleys of insulin production. And what happens to people who are grazing all day or have been told to eat 6 meals a day and that kind of advice that's sometimes given, which from the standpoint of insulin and weight gain is actually spectacularly bad advice. Other bad advice heard commonly is to cut out fat. Fat actually encourages the feeling of fullness, satiety, and good fats. Now, we want to avoid heavily processed fats. We want to avoid all trans fats. Now, if you've done intermittent fasting, particularly if you've gotten up to something like an 8-hour window of eating all your meals during the day and a 16-hour period of fasting overnight, you may, and assuming that goes reasonably well, and most people can adjust to this. It may take a while if you've been on the kind of grazing plan, but you can, over a period of a few weeks, definitely get used to this intermittent fasting routine, which, by the way, most of our ancestors did pretty much every day. Okay, this idea of snack food and grazing and eating 6 meals a day, these are all pretty much inventions of the last 50 years. And we can pretty much tie the beginning of the obesity epidemic with some of these practices. I, for example, fast every Saturday, which means I have a meal on Friday night and I have another meal on Sunday morning, and I don't eat any food at all. I just drink water. And by the way, if you are going to fast, please drink water. Some people claim that dry fasting by allowing yourself to also become dehydrated is more effective. I strongly disagree with that recommendation and would advise people to not do that. But fasting itself is something that's remarkably well tolerated. If you're interested in learning more about these topics, I highly recommend the work of a Canadian kidney doctor named Dr. Jason Fung. He's written a book called The Complete Book of Fasting. He's also written a book called The Obesity Code. And he talks about a number of the things that I'm mentioning here. And it's a contrarian point of view, but it's one that is really consistent with the science. And I personally find it compelling. People have been doing this for religious reasons for thousands of years. And as long as you're not frail, and as long as you're not terribly underweight, it's very well tolerated. And particularly once you build up your intermittent fasting times to where you can tolerate going without food longer, moving to a full day fast is really not that big a deal. As I said, every Saturday, I go for what's about 38 hours without any food. And it's a challenge on some level, but not because of hunger, more because I like food. I sometimes find myself fantasizing about what I'm going to eat when I break the fast. So it's a challenge, but the beauty of fasting and intermittent fasting, besides its effects on insulin, is that it does not do what all calorie-restricted diets do. It does not lower your metabolic rate. Your body does not compensate and thwart your efforts to keep the weight loss off. So there are a few ideas. I hope they're helpful. I hope you guys are hanging in with this prolonged pandemic, which from all appearances looks like it's going to keep on keeping on for quite a long time. Take good care. Namaste.